Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to a burst of inspiration where each week we are able to share some insights from the wisdom of the Torah with our community, with the wider community. So today is a very special day. It's the 11th of Cheshvan, that's the Hebrew date, and that is considered the date for the Yortzeit of Rachel Imenu, Rachel, our matriarch, who was the wife of Jacob, Yaakov, and we know that she had an exceptionally difficult and challenging life, and I'd like to share an idea which I think should encourage us and will be a tribute to her. So we know that she struggled. She was barren for many years, whereas Leah, who was the other main wife of Jacob, she had children. Rachel didn't. And we're told, Vatera Rachel, that Rachel saw, Ki lo yauda liYaakov, Vatakaneh Rachel ba'achoisa. She was jealous of her sister because she was barren. Vatomer el Yaakov, Havali bonim v'im mesa anochi. Please, I want to have children. And if I don't have children, then mesa anochi, I'm dead. Right? And we know that as a consequence of this, eventually, she gave her handmaiden Bilhah to Yaakov. Yaakov was through Bilhah, they were able to have children. And eventually, of course, Rachel was able to have two very special sons, Yosef and Binyamin. But I want to go back. We know, I'm sure we all realize where Rachel was buried. Rachel was buried not in the Hebron, not in the Kiryat Arba, in the grave of the cave Marat HaMachpelah, the cave where all the matriarchs and patriarchs are buried. She's the only one that wasn't buried there. She was buried where she died on the road to Lechem. Okay, you can go there today and see it. And she has a tomb there, and that is where she was buried. Why is it that she was buried there rather than being buried in the cave of Machpelah? Because there was an idea and a tradition that Rachel, who cried so much of her life about children, she wanted to have children, and without children, she felt that she was dead to the world, and therefore there is this tradition. We find the words in Jeremiah, Ko amar Hashem, ani kolech mibechi, that we find that uncontrollably Rachel was crying. Constantly she's crying. Why is she crying? Why is she buried along the road of Bethlehem? Because she's crying about her children that eventually are going to go into exile. And she's going to see them leaving, being banished from the Holy Land, going into exile. And she cries out and she says in consolation to the Jewish people when they are forced to go into the exile of Babylon, she says, that don't worry, I'm crying, I'm praying for you for your return. V'shavu vonim ligvulam, and eventually, I know that you're going to come back. You're going to return to Israel. And this, of course, is considered a source of comfort to the Jewish people, knowing that Rachel is waiting, as it were, on the road. It's the road to exile, but it's also, friends, the road to redemption. That is the road that we are going to come back. And we're told that through her handmaiden Bilhah had a son. What was the son's son called? He was called Dan, D-A-N, Dan, okay, Dan. And the tribe of Dan traveled at the very back. We know there was a formation that the Jewish people walked through the desert. Wherever they went, there was a formation. And Dan was at the very, very back of the Jewish people. And the job of Dan, we're told, was to pick up the stragglers. You know, when you go on a tiyul, when you go on an outing, and I can see that Richard's there. I remember when we went to trips through Europe, we were always waiting for some people. I'm not pointing out Richard. I'm just saying I remember going with Richard on the trip, and I remember there were a few stragglers. So Dan's job was that they were there to be able to bring up the rear guard. that they were able to point out, to see those that were not able, that were falling behind, and therefore they were able to pull them along, to bring them so that no Jewish person, no Jewish child would ever be left behind. And the idea, the mission of Dan to bring up the rear is not just talking about the time that the Jewish people were in the wilderness. We know that the Torah is not a history book, but it is lessons and insights, timeless insights for us over the course of the millennia, over the course of our history. And therefore the job of Dan is to remind us that always the job of the Jewish people, the job of the tribe of Dan, is that they're always going to bring back, pull up those that have fallen off, those that have been left behind, those that have fallen through the cracks. And it's not just when it comes to Dan. The Chasam Sofer says that there were times in our history when we could have already been redeemed. We know that we're in exile. We know that we're with so much pain, sorrow, suffering, angst in our rank and file. We can see it today with the damning report on Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, riddled with injustice, lies, deceit, time and again. But that's part of exile. That is part of what we are having to go through. And the message of the Chasam Sofer is that there were times in our history when we could have been redeemed along the way. There were times when we could have been already back in Israel with the redemption and peace in our time. But that would have meant it wouldn't have been a Geula Shalema. It wouldn't have been the whole Jewish people. Some wouldn't have been worthy. And therefore, part of us staying behind in exile with all the sorrow, with all the pain that we are enduring, the idea is that we're not prepared to have the redemption until every Jewish person, every neshama, every soul, every child comes back with us. We're not going to come home. We're not prepared for it to be the few. We want it to be the many. We want it to be every Jewish person, because as we saw with Dan, everyone is precious in the eyes of the Almighty. And therefore, we're going to wait. And therefore, Rachel is standing, as it were, spiritually, crying, waiting for the Jewish people, refusing to be consoled, refusing to be comforted. Where do we see this also? Jacob. I was thinking that Jacob, when Yosef had been lost, and his children came to him to console him, to tell him, Dad, it's true that Yosef has been lost. He's been torn to pieces by an animal. But think, at least you've got all of us. Move on with life. And we know that Yaakov refused to be consoled. He refused to be comforted. Why? How can you be consoled and comforted over the loss and move on with life if that person is still very much alive? Yaakov knew that Yosef was still there. Yosef was still alive. He felt it in his bones. He knew it in his soul. And so it is that Rachel refuses to be consoled or comforted because she's still crying, because the Jewish people are still very much alive. And therefore her tears are going to be a schus, a merit for us to eventually to come home. We move on in the Parsha itself, the Torah portion. So much to say, so much beauty. It's absolutely majestic. So the beginning of the Torah portion, we're told that Abraham is told, Vayom Hashem el Avram, Lech lecha mi'artzecha mi'mozecha mi'beis avicha. Abraham is told to leave his land, his birthplace, mi'beis avicha, and from the house of your father, and you're meant to go to the land which I will show you, or I will make you shown. Then the Torah goes on to say, I'm going to make you into a great nation. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make your name great. What happens next? You are going to be a source of blessing. Look at this Rashi. Rashi says on the spot, one of the great commentators, he says as follows, Habrachos nesunum biyadcha, that the blessings were given into the hand of Abraham. What does that mean? That Abraham had the ability to bless. Ad achshav hayu biyodi, until now they were just exclusively in my hands. And then God says, Bechosi la'adam v'noach, God blessed Adam. God blessed Noach. And then what? Now the gift of blessing was given over, transmitted to Abraham to be able to bless those that he wished to bless. The Torah goes on and says, and this is the part that we want to pick up on. Listen to this beautiful Rashi. God, I'm going to make you into a great nation. That refers, when it says in the verse that I'm going to make you into a great nation, that refers to the God of Abraham. And I will bless you. The verse carries on to say, that refers to Elokei Yitzchak, the God of Isaac. I'm going to make your name great. This refers to the God of Jacob. Says Rashi, it may be thought that we will conclude the blessing with all of them. And it'll be blessed. They will be blessed in you and not in all of them. What exactly does this enigmatic, puzzling, cryptic Rashi mean? Friends, I want to give you three explanations as to what we are dealing with, what we are referring to. Okay? And in fact, it's so puzzling, this Rashi, that the Talmud, the oral tradition, picks up on it. And the Talmud tells us as follows. Why is it? We're told, again, Rashi says to us that we're going to be blessed. I'm going to bless you through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's what the verse is alluding to. But the verse concludes, V'yeh bracha. Ultimately, the source of blessing is going to be in the hands of Abraham, through Abraham, not through the others. Why? Let's have a look at the Amida. The Amida, we say, Elokei Abraham, Baruch atah Hashem, Reinu, Elokeinu v'Elokei Avosenu. Blessed are you, O God, the God of our father, Elokei Avosenu, the God of our forefathers, the God of Elokei Abraham, the God of Abraham, Elokei Yitzchak, the God of Isaac, v'Elokei Yaakov, and the God of Jacob. Okay, right? And then how do we carry on with that Amida? What's the end of the first blessing? Baruch atah Hashem, Magen Avraham. That we say, blessed are you, O God, who is the defender, the shield of Abraham. So again, to summarize, the beginning of every Amida starts off with us saying that we say that Elokei Abraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. We speak about blessing coming through, that we are going to channel our energies through the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And then we say, but ultimately it is the blessing, and the ultimate blessing will come through the God of Abraham. Strange. Why couldn't we conclude by saying all three, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Why only through Abraham? Let's have a look at three fascinating insights if we have time. So it goes as follows. The first explanation is that comes from the Bnei Yisachar. Bnei Yisachar says as follows. We know that each of the patriarchs stood for a certain virtue. Okay? We know that the Torah stands on three pillars. Torah, Avoda, Gemilas Chasodim. Torah, referring to education, learning of Torah. Then Avoda, prayer. And then the third pillar is what? Is Yaakov, is Gemilas Chasodim. Okay? Sorry. So we've got three pillars. We've got Torah, Avoda, and Gemilas Chasodim. Those three pillars correspond to the patriarchs. So the Torah refers to Jacob. We'll explain in a minute. The Avoda, the prayer service, who is the initiator and the pillar, who represents the pillar of prayer, that's Isaac. And the third pillar, the pillar of chesed, of kindness, that is Abraham. Let us now see how the three pillars correspond to each of the patriarchs. So we find that in regards to Abraham, this is the most obvious one, that we find that Abraham stood for chesed, or for kindness. Think about the scene that we have of Abraham entertaining, offering hospitality to the three angels, the celestial beings. We see Abraham trying to save Lot's life, right? we see that Abraham, time and again, he is the pillar of chesed, of kindness. Then we see that Yitzchak went out into the fields to pray. He was on the binding of Isaac. He offered himself in self-sacrifice. So that is all about avoda, service, self-sacrifice, prayer. Then we find that there is also the pillar of Torah. That is Jacob. We know that Jacob was Ishtam Yoshev Olim. Jacob spent 14 years spending time learning in the yeshiva. We know that he sent Yehuda ahead to Goshen to be able to set up and establish a place of learning for education, for Torah. So each of the patriarchs represents a different pillar. Okay? Now, where are we in terms of these pillars? Where are we? We try to, as we are doing now, to learn, right? We try to pray, and we try to do chesed, kindness. All three are three things that we try and endeavor to do. But if we are honest, there are some that in our generation we do better than previous generations. Consider the following. So Chief Rabbi Lau, previous Chief Rabbi of Israel, now the Chief Rabbi of Tel Aviv, he was once in a meeting with Ariel Sharon, the late Prime Minister of Israel. And he said, Ariel Sharon, who was by no means a religious man, yet he met with a bunch of teenagers and he interviewed them and asked them some questions. And he said to them, have you ever heard of Ma'ariv? Right? We know what Ma'ariv is. It's the evening service. And they said, Ma'ariv, that's the newspaper, the newspaper in Israel. And Ariel Sharon was absolutely shocked, dismayed. They may not be religious, they may have been secular, but he couldn't get his head around the fact that Israelis living in Israel, in the promised land, and yet they didn't know what the service of Ma'ariv was all about. They'd been brought up in such a secular way that they had no idea. There was no Torah, no pillar of Torah. Golda Meir, in fact, she went one better than Ariel Sharon. And she was completely secular, no fault of her own. She came from Russia, didn't have any Jewish upbringing. We've discussed it before. She said famously, I want my children to know what they do not believe in. I want my children to know, said Golda Meir, what they do not believe in. And that was her mindset. She didn't want them to be religious, but there was the status quo, at least that they should know what is Yerushalayim, what does it mean, Ma'ariv, what does it mean, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, right? They should know about their past. I think if we are honest with ourselves, in our generation, to a large degree, for most of the Jewish people, the Torah, the heritage, has been forgotten and lost. So many are completely ignorant about our history, about our past. They cannot read, they don't know how to pray, they don't know basic Jewish law. It's almost like it's been forgotten. The people of the book have become illiterate. That's one of the pillars. Let's look at the next pillar. What about when it comes to prayer? So again, this was the pillar of Isaac. How many are engaged, are able to feel moved by prayer? How many are able to open a siddur and know one end from the other? Some yes, but many sadly no. And even those that do know, so many do it out of rote or out of habit. They don't actually really engage. It's not a transformational experience like it is meant to be. They're not able to relate to tefillah the way they are able to speak or write, to feel a communication, a connection with the Almighty when they pray. And therefore, these two pillars for so much of our community have been lost and forgotten in our generation. Many through no fault of their own. We're not coming to judge. We're just making an observation. You know, they tell the story of the rabbi who was giving a sermon. And you know, there's a tradition that whenever a rabbi gives a sermon, everyone falls asleep. It's like a mitzvah. When the rabbi gives a sermon, everyone falls asleep. And so there was this community. I'm not going to say which community. And every week the community, the front rows, schluffen, everyone was sleeping. And then the Gabba saw what was going on, and he decided to stir up trouble. He saw that even the president of the synagogue, this president was falling asleep. So he said to the rabbi, you know, the president's falling asleep in your drosha, in your sermon. I've got an idea. I'll take a baseball bat, and when he falls asleep, I'll give him a tap. I'll wake him up. So the rabbi says it's not only should you do it, it's a mitzvah for you to do it. So the next Shabbos, the president's got his baseball bat. Off he goes, sees the president's fallen asleep, whacks him over the head. Nothing. Does it again, and eventually the president jumps up. President jumps up and he says, looks up, he says to the Gabba says, wake up, wake up. The president says, has the rabbi finished yet? He says, no. So let me sleep. So many are ignorant, sleeping through life. But what about the third pillar? What about the third pillar that we have as a nation, as a people? Chesed. The end of generation, says the Bnei Yisachar, that is the one pillar, kindness, caring for each other, that will remain intact. Says the Bnei Yisachar, we said in the Rashi that at the end we conclude with the B'cha Chaismin, where we conclude that blessing with the seal of Abraham. We finish the Amida with Magen Avraham, specifically Abraham, who represented Chesed and kindness. And that is because it is Abraham, that pillar of Chesed, of kindness, that is going to be that means for us to be able to bring the Geula Shlema, the ultimate redemption. We may not be able to pray. We may not be able to learn Torah the way that we should, but everyone is capable to learn, to be involved in Chesed, in kindness. That is what is going to protect us. That's the Magen Avraham, the shield of Abraham. And therefore, that is the means for us to be able to bring us and our people back. So we're running out of time. So therefore, we are going to stop there. We'll save the other two pillars for another day and not the other two explanations. But suffice to say that what we are being told, both from the first explanation, the first idea that we saw, the beautiful idea relating to Rachel and the fact that she is crying, is that every single Jew is precious, and every single person is needed for the ultimate redemption. It's not enough for the Mitsuyonim, those that are distinct, those that are exceptional. Every single person can and is an essential part of the Jewish people. It's the chesed, the kindness, the hospitality. Now in COVID, as we are in that second wave, that's the challenge. Are we sleepwalking? Have we forgotten other people? Or are we still wide awake? Are we thinking and concerned for the welfare of other people? It's the little acts. It doesn't mean you've got to go shopping for them. It doesn't mean that you've necessarily got to start cooking meals for them. A simple text or a phone call is immeasurable, precious in making someone's day. You know what you do? You make them feel $1 million. Like Rachel is crying every day for our Jewish people that are in exile, that are feeling pain and sorrow. So it is that we should feel the sorrow and pain of other people. And if we are able to have chesed and kindness in our lives, then I can assure you, together we will look out and ensure that no Jew is left behind, and every member of Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people, will be able to walk together past Kever Rachel, past the place of the resting place of Rachel, and we'll be able to come back. We're all going to come back together, singing the praises of the Jewish people and looking forward to an end in exile, end of anti-Semitism, and peace in our time. Shabbat Shalom, be well, take care, keep safe.